Alrighty, hello everyone. Hope everyone had a wonderful week. I'm going to speak out an idea about what's going on in this week's parsha. Be'ez Hashem can be zochet to some level of MS and to understand hopefully a life lesson. So we know that it says Vayikra b'nei Aaron Nadav v'Avihu, a famous story in which Nadav and Avihu take these machtos and they're makriv ketoras. And as a result, they die. And so Moshe says to Aaron, Moshe Dibra Hashem Lemar, Wikra Kadesh Apnei Kol HaMikaved. That Rashi says that it says Neish Bechvaydi, and it's Atik Bechvaydi Mechubadai. So on the Moshe Aaron, Anachi said, Deish Kash Bash Nidav Shamakam, Vesi Savar Ovi Eva. I thought it'd be near you. Ashavar Shem Bidalim Mimanim Chas. Now I see that they're actually greater than us. Here the two sons, Nadav and Avihu. So this whole Indian has a lot of different kashas, and we're gonna speak out the kashas, and we're gonna try to start a teretz, and perhaps we can glean something along the way. There are what it would seem to be like many reasons that Nadav and Avihu die, and it's really difficult to understand which one is really true, and unfortunately, some of them seem to be that they would be mutually exclusive. The first reason we know is that it says in Devarim that Aaron HaKohen did the Chedeiga, and says that Hashem wanted to be mashmid, he wanted to destroy Aaron, and Chazal say that the definition of destroying somebody completely, the hashmid, is their children. It's for their children to be wiped out, and therefore they had no continuation, so you've completely uprooted, destroyed them. And therefore Aaron's children were nigzar to be killed. Now, Moshe davened for him is Palel Hashem, and then Rashi says is Ha'ila Tfilasi Lemechza, that is Moshe's tefillas worked for half of the Gzera, and therefore only two of Aaron's sons died. Now, that is a very difficult thing to say, because we know famously, right? Pasuk in Devarim, it says that what that Lo Yomsu Avos Habanim, Lo Yomsu Avos Ish Bechato Yomaser. Right, so we know that this is seemingly an impossibility. How could it be that Nadav and Avihu are dying as a result of a chait of Aaron HaKohen? That wasn't their chait, and we know that sons do not get killed for the chataim of their fathers. So what is the pasuk shot in that reason? That's the first question. Now we have Vayter. We have the pasuk shot in the psukim, which says that the reason why they were killed was because they were makriv and eish zara. That's what it says in the pasuk, that they were makriv and eish zara, and therefore they were killed. And then you have in the pasuk further that Moshe says b'kovaya kadesh. So basically this, you have that they did a maisa which HaKadosh Baruch Hu never commanded them to do, and then the fire came out and ate them. So the reason for why they got killed is because they did this maisa of hakrava of eish zara. Then Moshe tells Aaron, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to make Kiddush Hashem through the exacting of din, and therefore resulting in misa, resulting in death of one of his holy people. The thing is, I didn't know who was Mir. Now I see they're greater than us. So it sounds like it's due to their greatness of Nadav and Avihu that they got killed. L'cha'ira, we know the pasuk right before that said that they got killed because they did a ma'aseh which God didn't command, as an ezara. Those two things are mutually exclusive. You can't say I did something wrong, and that is why I got killed, and then also tell me that why I got killed, because I was needed to make an example of. I was a sacrifice. I needed to be shown to the Jewish people how far the Midas Hadin goes, and because of that, that's why they died. If that's the reason, then it wasn't because of anything they did, but you just said they did Hakriv and Zara. And you also said that the reason why they died is because of the punishment for Aaron. It's not a punishment for Aaron. See, you're already in a problem. First of all, you're giving me a bunch of reasons. Punishment for Aaron, being Makriv Zara, or to be made an example of. What does it mean? It's not all three. If that's a real enough of a reason, then that's the reason. So that's a problem. Then you're saying things that are mutually exclusive. If you're saying it's as a result of the punishment for their father, then that means it's nothing they did. But you said that it is because something they did, because they were Makir Zara. And then if you say it's because they're made an example of, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs to be miskadesh through the misa of through the death of a tzaddik, then it's not as a punishment for their father, and it's also not anything they did. It was just because they were sacrificial lambs, so to speak, right? They were being they were karbanos because HaKadosh Baruch Hu needed to make an example of din for the Jewish people. So that's why. But it wasn't either of those things. So it's very difficult to understand how these things even come together and make sense. We know that it's punishment for Aaron. We know that they did a krav ezdar, and we know, and it says in the psukim that the whole reason was that that they're supposed to be just because they were made an example for. All these things are mutually exclusive. They make no sense that they exist at the same time. Furthermore, we have a Chazal, and the Chazal say that the reason why Nadav and Avihu were Chayav Misa was because Rashi says over here, by Har Sinai, Nadav and Avihu looked at the Shechina in an appropriate manner. It says, Nistaklu ve'tzitzu, and it's Chayvu Misa, Rashi says. So Nadav and Avihu and the Shivim Zkenim became Chayav Misa from Matan Torah, because they looked at HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence in an inappropriate manner. As God didn't want to upset the Simchas Torah, and therefore, Hinta Nadav and Avihu Adiyom Chanukas HaMishkan. So he waited for Rabbi until the day of Chanukas HaMishkan. It sounds like none of you are Chayav Misa because it's something wrong they did, that they looked at the Shechina incorrectly. So now you have another reason that they would be Chayav Misa. So not because of Zara, not because of punishment for Aaron, not because they need to make Kiddush Hashem, but because they looked at HaKadosh Baruch Hu in an inappropriate manner by Shechina, which they're not supposed to do, and therefore they were Chayav Misa. So now you have this reason. So l'chayra, it's so schwer to understand what is the actual reason that why are they actually being killed. There's a million reasons that Chazal seem to be giving for their misa, and many of them are mutually exclusive, and so l'chayra they can't be true at the same time. L'chayra. Then you have the famous Chazals that say that famous Chazals say that they give the whole list of reasons why Nadav and Avihu were killed. Some say because they were Shesui Yain. Some say because they didn't have children. Some say because they didn't get married. Some say, there's a million different reasons that Chazal give. And the Chayram, and some say Mechusar Begadim over here. It says they didn't wash their hands. Some say because they went lifnai lifnim, they went into the Kodesh HaKodashim. Here it says Nonasu Melech, Nonasu Nashim. It seems to be that Chazal are fabricating reasons. Even in the Torah itself, we already have enough contradictory reasons that we don't even understand how those things can be true altogether. But now Chazal are going ahead and they're fabricating more reasons when it says in the pasuk that it was because they were Makiv Zara. So if it's because they're Makiv Zara, so that's why. What do you need more reasons for? It says in the pasuk that it's also because of Kravei HaKodesh, which doesn't even make sense with the fact that they're Makiv Zara, or the fact that it says in the pasuk earlier that they're in the Chai Misa because of their mates in the Shechina. So it's extremely difficult to understand how all these reasons can exist at the same time, and what it really means that there are Chazal coming up with all these extra reasons for why Nadav and Avihu were killed. So, Achayra, to understand, I'm trying to begin an answer over here. Get an insight into this idea of what they were trying to do to Avihu by being Makrev Ketaris. When we know that there's Ketaris and there is Karbanos, and Karbanos are essentially mechanisms It is a mechanism that is used with different formats, chatas, ola, shlamim, etc. That carbon comes in the notion of karev, that you're coming close to something because there's a distance between the two things, and then by doing this act, you are bringing yourself closer to HaKadosh Baruch. We know that in the avodah of the Mishkan, there was a carbon tamid, and then there was a carbon in the morning, and all the karbanos had to start and finish between the carbon tamid and the carbon biker and the carbon tamid, and then the ben arbayim, the one that was in the afternoon. So basically, you started off with the carbon tamid of shachar, you ended off with the carbon of the ben arbayim, the last carbon tamid, and then in between those two karbanos, all the regular karbanos, all the other types of karbanos that the Mishkan would process on a regular day. That's when they would happen. And we know that Keteris, which also happened regularly, happened after that. It happened after the Kabbalas. What this shows us is that Keteris is not a Maisa, is not an Inyan, which someone does in order to achieve Hakrava. They don't do that to achieve closeness. Rather, Keteris happens after all of the karbanos were brought, after all the kirva, the closeness, was achieved for the day, then you brought keteris. And what we see, in addition to that, we also know that the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim goes lifnai lifnim, goes to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the holiest place in the Beis HaMikdash, and he brings there keteris. And what we really see from that is that keteris is an act done by a kohen, in order to show that at the current state that kohen is in, he and the Jewish people are one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They are totally connected, and they're totally one. However, it is not possible to be makriv ketoris, because the act of akrava is by definition meaning that you are trying to get closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through a maisa, and therefore you bring something instead of you, and that thing is nikrav, and then through that you become closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the act of ketoris is just an act which brings HaKadosh Baruch Hu to you. It makes you one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, that's what the point of ketoris is. Now, if someone brings ketoris and they don't have anything, if someone brings ketoris and they're trying to be makriv, what they're actually being makriv is themselves. And that's because if you bring in ketoris, what you're saying is that I want to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu by virtue of my own self, without there being anything between those two things for it to be an akrava. That's one way to say it. Or you say that really, when you bring ketoris, which wasn't commanded, essentially what you're doing is you are sacrificing yourself, because what ketoris does is it brings HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence immediately to the people and to the place that are being makriv that ketoris. So on Yom Kippur, that we have a tzivoy, and we're damel malachim, and it's the one day that HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgives all our sins. That's when the Kohen Gadol, he goes lifnai lifnim, which is what Nadav and Avihu did. They went lifnai lifnim, and so then we achieve kapara as opposed to being killed. But Nadav and Avihu, they went lifnai lifnim, not in Yom Kippur, not in the state of being where this was. And therefore, what they essentially did was, and this is brought down in one of the Achronim, but Nadav and Avihu actually were makriv themselves. They actually sacrificed themselves. And this is a very, very interesting mahalach to take in this story. But if you look at the lashon of the pasuk over here, it's striking. It says, when it says that they makriv the korban, it says, right? So this is basically what's occurring in terms of the relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the world at that period. These words. The Eish goes out and it eats. Then what does it eat? The Mizbeach. Now if you look here, by Navi Naviu, it doesn't say God got upset and he smit them, or God, by other times in the Bamidbar and throughout the Chumash, it says, Vayikar Hashem, he upset and he killed them. It doesn't say HaKadosh Baruch Hu killed them. It just says, and look, if you look at these Lashonis, it's crazy that they're basically the exact same words. It says, over here also, this is talking about the exact same thing that happens. Aish goes out in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and it eats them. And then Vayamusu Lifnei Hashem, then they die in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It doesn't say that Hashem was meimis them. Hashem didn't kill them. The Ish came out and consumed them. And then, as a result, they died in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What this shows us is that Nadav and Avihu was a Maisa of Hakrava. It was a Maisa of Hakrava, and there's another story in which people take guitars, and that's by Korach. And the pasuk over there says that they did the exact same thing. They took guitars. In fact, the Lashonos are very similar. And I can't get into that now, but it says that they knew that they were going to be killed as a result of doing this. And that's because what you're doing is, when you're makri guitarist, you are putting yourself in a situation of complete oneness and connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and as a result of the fact that you're in a human body, by definition, that's not sustainable. And Mamela, you have to leave the form of the human body. And I think that is really the correct mahalach to take it. None of you actually sacrifice themselves, and that is why the Yesod, that's why it's not a kasha that it was a punishment for Aaron, because they were the ones who did it themselves. They were the ones who sacrificed themselves. And there's a lot more to answer this cheshbon, but I think the main point that this brings out is a fascinating idea, which is that we understand that korbanos are the idea of bringing one closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we know that korbanos, as you know, which is the whole point of parshas Vayikra, are actually, they're an institution. In other words, the korbanos are something that is meant, that is a tzivu, it's a command to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for it to happen on a daily basis, all the time. Think about it. The fact that we have korbanos on a regular basis implies that there is an inherent distance between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the fact that those korbanos are institutionalized implies that that distance is a distance which is meant to be. Because if it's not meant to be, then you wouldn't institutionalize a korban. If chas v'shalom someone did a sin, then they would bring a korban, okay, or you say that you have korbanos for a certain period, but then when Klal Yisrael perfects itself, then they don't need korbanos anymore. Why do I need something to bring me close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? I am close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I shouldn't need something to take me to that point. I should be able to get to that point, and that should be the goal. The fact that it's institutionalized means that there is something inherent about the format of existence that we have that makes us rachok from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's meant to be that way. And the shayla is, what really is that? And I think the yesod over here is that the concept of the richuk from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we have is itself the idea of the process necessary for human beings to go through in this world in order to then achieve a state of being which can be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it is therefore true that the distance between a human being and HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world is actually implied and is brought out by his physical format itself. And we know this. How do we know this? Because we know that there were 4 people that never made a mistake in their life. They never did a sin. And the Gemara says that they died be'etyoy shel nachash, in the bite of the nachash, which is the nachash that convinced Adam HaRishon to sin. Which means that the concept of death, and this is Pasha, the concept of death is as a result of the fact that mankind sinned. So since we sinned, Memela, there is now death, which means that the form of our bodies, which reflect the fact that we die, is a form which reflects a state of being which we have as a result of sin. Sin being defined as a place of distance from God. So Memela, in order to have a sustainable relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world, there's always a constant kirva, always a constant closeness through sacrifice, and then ultimately in the next world, that's when you can have a complete oneness, when the body is no longer in its form, in Machlekes Rambam, but simple pshat, the body is no longer in its form that would restrict you from that. So when we say that Nadav and Avihu, the Eish went out and ate them, that is not a punishment. It's not a punishment that they lost their lives because of the fact that what they wanted was a complete oneness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is what they got, a complete oneness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, we understand that the reasons that Chazal are giving, Chazal are not telling you a reason why Nadav or Avihu were punished. That's not what they're saying. What Chazal are doing is that they're outlining the format of Nadav and Avihu's lives through which one can see that the act that they were doing was an act of self-sacrifice and as an act of a decision to remarket themselves to be one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as opposed to anything else. And the way that you see that, as Chazal say, for example, is that they didn't have any children, right? So if someone of their stature doesn't have any children, well, essentially what that means is that they don't have a desire to be part of the process and the history of the Jewish people. Rather, they want themselves, their personal beings, to be completely one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they're not interested in the investment of time into Klal Yisrael so that Klal Yisrael gets there. Not interested in that. They just want to be completely one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu themselves. In other words, they're existing in a vacuum. They don't want to invest in Klal Yisrael. They don't care about the future of Klal Yisrael, which is why they're not having kids, and they don't even get married. So they're not even a mishpacha. And if you're not a mishpacha, then you're not even a chelik of Klal Yisrael. The units that comprise Klal Yisrael is a mishpacha. It's a mishpachos make a shevet, and a shevet makes a Yisrael. And so if you're not even a mishpacha, you're not even a chelik of Klal Yisrael at all. And therefore, it's very clear that Chazal is setting up, or let's say, shtuya yayin, right? Or begadim. Right? All these things are essentially formats that are necessary for avodah to be done within, due to the fact that it is not 100% the person himself who is connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a manner with no boundaries. He's connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a certain way, in a certain boundary, at a certain time, in a certain place, in a certain state of mind. That is when he can connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is specific because of the fact that the connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to come over a period of time and over a process, so that it builds up within all of Israel, and then the overall identity of Israel is such that they are connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then the world in general can get to that place. And the actual brilliance of what ends up occurring with the Akrav of Nadav and Avihu is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses their Maisa to be in a complete oneness with Him, to do exactly what they didn't want to do in their lives. Why is that? Because we know that that is what it's talking about when it says Bikrevai Ekodesh, which is that the ones who are closest to me, I'm going to be Nigdash. And Rashi says it's to show you how far din goes. And I think, that is Gufo, what Nazarene of you didn't want to do as people in their own lives. They didn't want to invest in Klal Yisrael and giving them an awareness and in doing everything that requires for them to develop and grow into the next stage. All they wanted was to be just to make it that right now in this very moment we're going to be as close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as is possible, and we're going to just be closer and closer and closer without any boundaries or limits or processes. And then that's it. That's all we want. And we want the process to be over here, right? And they were tzaddikim, and they were great tzaddikim, and therefore they themselves did go to the level where they became one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the main, I think, lesson from this, from this story and this Maisa is that we have to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu how He wants us to relate to Him. In other words, through a tzivoy. And we have to do it also in a manner which embraces the process of becoming close to Him in terms of the people that we are, not just doing a Maisa or acting as if we are someone who is already close to Him. And the last thing is, which you see, which was the whole point of the murder of not murder, the dying of Nadar Naviu, is to see at Heicha Midas Hadin goes, and we discussed this by Yitzchak Avinu, that we understood that Midas Hadin was not something that is an objective metric of what a person is or a person is not. Midas Hadin is the demand of the world to express its most underlying truth at any given moment. And what it drives is the necessity of actualization of the world in the direction of a complete awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that Midas Hadin is something that occurs to someone where he lives and he operates in a manner in which the result of the meisim that he does can create an impression upon another person, so that impression becomes the development of that person. In other words, if I see someone, I see a god or whatever, I see how great, and I'm inspired or in awe and shock of the greatness. So you see that, and then that emotion that drove me, that is the development that I got. And that is the aside over here of what occurs with Nadav and Avihu. Nadav and Avihu are the greatest tzaddikim of the generation. And Baruch Hu is also din in them, which makes an impact upon the rest of the Jewish people to realize how demanding and how true the reality of the demand of the world to actualize and come to its final form and its most perfect form really is. And that it gets more and more detailed it gets more and more harsh for tzaddikim as they become greater and greater tzaddikim. Which is obviously because of the fact that if you are a tzaddik, your ability to impact other people is higher, and your factual impact is higher, because people look up to you. So you're gonna have a din, which is much higher, because din means how much are you able to impact the world around you to come to his actualization, or how much damage do you do? So if someone who's a tzaddik has, does something that is, you know, he's chaser in doing something which could have made a kiddush Hashem, then that's a din. That's what happened to Moshe and Aaron themselves, actually, as well. And if he does something chas Hashem chil Hashem, it's even more. So it basically it increases and decreases with the person's ability to impact the world around him and the level of sensitivity that he has. And that is because din means how much do you contribute towards the world's demand that it actualize. If you're a big tzaddik and you have a high level of awareness and you understand what needs to be done and people look up to you and respect you, then when you perform negatively or fail to perform, that is an opportunity that was missed, and you missed that opportunity because you knew you had the opportunity because you were tzaddik enough to be aware of the opportunity and to make the impact. So therefore, you're judged on an even higher scale. And that is what ends up happening over here with Nadav and Avihu. And I think that's probably the main yesod over here, that people have to realize that the extent of the impact that they have upon the world and their ability to improve that world is their full responsibility to embrace those things and those impacts that they can do. And if they don't do that, then they're going to be punished accordingly. And therefore, a person always has to be sensitive to what his impact is going to be to those around him, and to satisfy the Midas Hadin, and to make sure that he is doing everything that he can so that the world can actually go forward and develop, and that other people can have a more heightened awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Shabbos.